Nikki Haley, America's ambassador to the United Nations, is leaving her post at the end of the year. What significance can we read into the timing of the announcement, and who will replace her? And as Chinese investment in Australia falls significantly, what does this say about the state of relations between the two countries? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xi. Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, is to leave her post at the end of the year. Haley claimed her exit is simply about needing a break after serving nearly 2 years in a row and 6 years as South Carolina's governor before that. Her replacement is unclear, although President Trump has said he will probably select a new ambassador in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Now, Nikki Haley will leave behind a job she helped elevate to one of the most influential in the Trump administration, raising the stakes for her successor and fueling speculation about her future. With speculation mounting as to what she will do next, Haley was quick to shoot down the idea that her ambitions include taking on Trump if the president looks vulnerable heading into his re-election in 2020. Advisors have already said that Haley is not interested in a Senate seat and was more likely to take board seats or secure other lucrative positions until after the 2020 election, noting her limited finances. So how much of a political impact will her departure create, and what will she be aiming for next? What will be her legacy at the United Nations? Joining me from Philadelphia, the U.S. is Brendan Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, and here in Beijing, Andy Mock, managing director of Red Pagoda Resources. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. First, let's talk about the timing of the announcement. Now, analysts have said that regarding the timing of the departure, she had little to gain politically by staying on the job. She leaves with a good reputation on her own terms and with the president still on good terms with her. So, Brandon, what do you make of the timing of her announcement?
It's perfect for her, and frankly, it's one of the few exits from the Trump administration that's actually well-timed for the Trump administration. Some people have complained that maybe she should have waited till after the midterm elections, but she's not a position that really would have affected the midterms. Leaving in the wake of the successful nomination and confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh allows the Trump administration to, during its victory lap, say, hey, one of our more impressive members is stepping away to join the private sector. That's a pretty standard operating procedure for any U.S. administration, and so it was a timing that coincided for a benefit for President Trump. But for Nikki Haley, I think you're right. Ambassador Haley, this is the time to get out. She gets out before anything negative can happen in the midterms. She gets out before she has to battle for longer on any other political issues. She's done everything conceivable she could have done positive with this role in terms of her profile. And this gives her at least a few years to step back into the private sector before considering a return.
Yeah, it has been argued that her influence had, however, diminished in recent months because her previous boss, Rex Tillerson, was relatively shy of the limelight. Now she seems to have been overshadowed by her new boss, Mike Pompeo, at Foggy Bottom, and by the hawkish National Security Advisor, John Bolton. So, Andy, are these likely have been strong reasons behind her departure?
Well, I think no one, of course, really knows, but I think driving these kinds of high-profile departures, of course, the relationships with key people that one works with is important. I think I agree with Brendan as well that it is a good time to leave. She's leaving on a high note. As they say in show business and in politics, it's leave while you're on top. So I think her timing is
before you are fired. Well, the announcement came days after the president was laughed at during the UN Security Council General Assembly, and that really isn't the picture of American greatness that President Trump is trying to sell. Instead, it seemed like a picture of America at a historic low when it comes to influences or image on the world stage. So, Brandon, was this moment the last straw as far as Haley was concerned?
I wouldn't say that President Trump would blame Ambassador Haley for any of those reactions. Frankly, it just reconfirms his belief that, in his opinion, the United Nations is useless. In his opinion, it's not a community of peers or a community of peer nations. It is a place for him to yell, scold, complain, be harsh, criticize, all things that Ambassador Haley was very successful at while being ambassador. Being laughed at just confirmed his opinion that it was useless. And I think that for Ambassador Haley to stay in a position where President Trump was seeing the institution as more and more useless to him wasn't really beneficial to her. The appointment of Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, combined with John Bolton, who's a former UN ambassador, means that really he doesn't need her advice anymore, and it's time for her to go on for something else.
Okay. Well, in her resignation letter, Haley told the president that returning from government to the private sector is not a step down, but a step up. Now, recent financial disclosures, according to the media in the U.S., reveal that Haley is hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, which could be alleviated by a lucrative private sector job. So, Andy, could this have been the main reason? And it's also actually quite surprising to me to know that she, being such a high position official, would be in such a financial situation.
Well, I think it's not uncommon for government officials to join the private sector for a spell. And in fact, there's a term for this in Washington called the revolving door, where people go from government to the private sector back to government. And I think it's quite natural, while for many viewers they might think making $100,000, $200,000, even $400,000 a year is not very much money, but this is what government public servants are paid in the United States versus the potential millions of dollars they can make in the private sector.
Yeah, well, I think she didn't accumulate these hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt while she was on this job. It must have started somehow before she took on this job, and she knows that this is a low-paying job. Why did she take this job in the first place? Andy.
Well, I think Nikki Haley is a talented politician that has an incredibly bright future in front of her. I mean, we look at her story, Indian immigrant, the daughter of Indian immigrants, by the dint of their enterprise and hard work, the classic American success story. She ran for state legislature, became governor, really surprised everybody with her ability to ably represent the U.S. interest at the UN, despite having little if no foreign policy experience before this role.
Okay, then let's talk about how she did as the U.S. representative in the United Nations. I mean, her tenure was praised by some fellow UN ambassadors and some foreign leaders, such as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but she was also remembered for having said things that pushed President Trump's hardline positions in a way that draw criticism from others. For instance, last December, before a vote on a resolution critical of the U.S.'s decision to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, she said the U.S. will be taking names of those who voted against the U.S. Brandon, how would you characterize her tenure?
Her tenure facing other nations was walking a tightrope. She was an avid supporter of many of President Trump's hardline stances. She was an effective spokesperson for his desire to be incredibly critical and break with convention, particularly on the Israel embassy issue that you mentioned. But what she was somewhat more impressive for able to do is that she was able to do that while maintaining ties to most of the orthodox conservative views in America. She was actually able to separate herself from President Trump by being very critical of Russia, for instance, and other strongman leaders that President Trump may not have been as critical of. Her tenure, I think, will be remembered for, one, elevating the position, and two, being able to balance personally representing President Trump effectively to the point where she was criticized, but also being remembered for keeping ties to the traditional conservative base of the Republican parties. Long term, that's what's going to benefit her as a politician.
Right, right. Well, China, upon knowing her departure, was diplomatic by saying that she maintained dialogue with Beijing on a number of key issues, as Brandon has pointed out. So, Andy, what impact do you think she will have on the multilateral mechanism of the United Nations? She didn't fall out with President Trump, but does she serve the U.S. interest in the long term?
I think she did very well serve the U.S. interest. I mean, we have to remember, too, as the ambassador to the United Nations, that her job is to represent the United States and represent the administration. And I think she did that very effectively and was able to disagree without being disagreeable, which not everyone in the Trump administration has managed. But I think the future of the UN will depend a lot more on what happens at the White House versus what the UN ambassador, whether that's her or her successor, has to say or do.
Yeah, Brandon, what do you think it will be her footprint at the United Nations? I mean, America first instead of American leadership, the hallmark of the Trump administration's foreign policy. Do you think she, by being a carrier of that message, or even, pushing it further, serve the interest of the United States as a leader of the post-Second World War world?
Well, I think how you answer that question, how I answer that question, is more about that policy rather than Ambassador Haley. I think that the America First Trump administration approach that was typified by many of Ambassador Haley's statements is harmful to the legacy of the United States. It's harmful to the community of nations that we live in. Ambassador Haley followed the line. She towed the party line. Long term, will it be helpful to the world? Her personality, we really won't know. Long term, she's going to be more of a player in domestic politics in the U.S., and all people will remember was that she was influential as the UN ambassador. That's it. That's all they're going to remember. U.S. politics don't really care about global representation other than to say, sort of, check a box, you have some experience. So if she wants to run for president in 2024 or run for another national office of some sort, her profile will always include positive things, and I don't necessarily think that I think she was able to separate herself enough that if the Trump administration's policies sort of crash and burn, as I see them doing, she won't be marred as much as maybe other members of his administration would be.
Okay. Well, concerning the question at whether she will run or not, I mean, she said this week she wouldn't run against Trump in 2020. Rather, she would campaign for him, which gave President Trump a broad ear-to-ear smile. There's a lot of time, however, between now and 2020. If, for instance, Robert Mueller, the independent investigator, finds something truly damaging against the President Trump, and the Democrats retake the House and trigger impeachment proceedings, senior Republicans could decide that they need a fresh face for 2020. So is the possibility of her running totally discounted, Andy?
I don't think so. I mean, again, there's a month is an eternity in American politics, so we're talking several eternities. So whether or not she challenges Trump, I think she is a political strategist, dream candidate for president, especially being in the Republican Party. I mean, her story, immigrant, successful business person, helping her parents' business, running for office in the most southern of southern states, proving herself in an international environment, being a woman. I think that she has a bright future ahead of her.
Okay, well, now that she will be going, who's going to replace her, and how is that going to change the balance of racial and gender mix within the Trump administration right now? After she leaves, there will only be 4 racial or ethnic minorities among the 23 cabinet-level jobs. Brandon, very briefly, who might replace her? Will the gender and racial elements influence the choice?
I think they may. I mean, the Trump administration has proven itself not to be shackled by those types of ideas, whether they should be or not. Yeah, would he care? Maybe not. But the safe money at the moment is on Dina Powell, a former deputy national security advisor, currently with Goldman Sachs. That would answer the question of gender identity politics. She's also pretty well qualified for the job. Other names are Richard Grenell, who's openly gay, so that would be another element of gender politics. But those two people are pretty well qualified and I think are the safe bets. But it's the Trump administration. They could pick somebody out of left field. He's already floated the name of Ivanka Trump, a name I don't think is a reality. I think he's right. There would just be too many charges against him. But Dina Powell is probably the safe bet.
Okay, we don't know until the last minute anyway. Many thanks to Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer and to Andy Mock. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be looking at the current relationship between China and Australia as new data shows a dramatic fall in Chinese investment in that country. Stay with us. Chinese investment in Australia has plunged 40% in 2017 from the year before. That's according to a report by the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research at the Australian National University. However, another joint analysis by KPMG, the professional service company, and Sydney University found that the drop is much smaller at 11%, and that the overall level of Chinese investment would be at a stable level in 2018 compared to the previous year. Whichever the number, the current level of investment is certainly going down amid heightened national security concerns over China's influence across the region and a spat between some in the Australian business community and the Australian government's handling of Beijing. What does this drop of investment mean for Australia, and will the new Scott Morrison administration bring a new picture to China-Australian economic relations? Joining me for the discussion from Sydney via Skype is Heng Wang, Associate Professor and Co-Director for China International Business and Economic Law Initiative at the University of New South Wales. And here in the studio, Professor Zhang Gong at the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, first let's take a closer look at the report. The Chinese investment, according to the Australian National University report, in Australia in 2016 was the peak recent year when Chinese investment in that country went up to $11 billion US. Now 2017 saw a 40% fall in Chinese investment, slumping down to $6 billion US. Quite a dramatic drop. But as I mentioned, another report by KPMG and by the Sydney University seemed to show a much smaller number at 11%. Professor Wang, which one is more accurate? Which one should we look at?
Well, I think it's been quite interesting because it's been a different research methodology. I may have a different data source for that, so I would say it's actually something in the middle of these two reports, maybe more accurate to look at.
Okay, so if you put 11% and 40% together and divide it by 2, that would be about 30.
25, I think.
There's the time for math. Yes, a test of math. 25%. Yeah. Okay, let's. Yes, yeah. Professor Wang.
Yeah, I just mean that's not meaning so simplistic. Those being average middle of those two numbers, but I think it's been probably a comfortable range, you know, to have a better understanding of what happens in the last year. Okay.
Okay, but the trend is very clear. It's quite a dramatic drop, Professor Wang. Would you say that?
Yeah. I think it's been what happened last year.
Okay, well, let's break it down and put it into perspective. I mean, last year China's foreign direct investment worldwide fell 20%. So let me go to Professor Gong here. Do you see anything wrong with the 20 to 30% drop in Chinese investment in Australia compared to the 20% Chinese investment drop worldwide?
Well, I think overall the China's overseas investment is slowing down last year, starting from what's happened with Rwanda. You know, starting from his incidents, I think the Chinese government has taken more of a controlling role in terms of approving those foreign direct investment, especially with respect to state-owned companies. And I think in the picture of Australia, I think, you know, I have actually more faith in that KPMG report because KPMG has been publishing reports on Chinese investment in Australia every year. And, you know, they're in the field, they talk to the businesses. So I put more faith in that. So I think, you know, in the grand scheme of things, I think 11% is quite still very moderate. And it is especially true compared to other countries. You know, last year, investments in Australia by other countries are also slowing down.
Right.
So it's not that bad of a picture.
So it's not so alarmist as some other people would find. Professor Wang, in Australia, how would you find, what do you think are the main reasons behind the drop of Chinese investment in Australia?
I think basically there are two sides of the story. One side is actually, from China's perspective, as you may have, China strengthens the regulation of foreign direct investment and to reduce speculative and irrational investment. And also have a consideration like the regulation of capital control on that. Another side of the story was from Australia's perspective. The foreign direct investment, we need to have those kind of they call the Foreign Investment Review Board clearance. And also another consideration, for example, with this year, they have the number of the major projects happening because that's determining the determination of this amount itself. And also as well as what's the choice available for Chinese investor because they can invest in Australia, but also can invest in other countries. So they have different factors which will play the role in this number.
Okay, but are you or are the Australian businesses and economic sector concerned of the negative impact of the shrinking Chinese investment there, Professor Wang?
I think it's basic, again, it's been on two sides of that. I think definitely Australia highlights the importance of foreign investment because Australia does not really have sufficient funding, you know, by themselves. Foreign investors always play a very important role, providing more job opportunities and also other economic developments, incentives. Another side of the story was that also they want to make sure that foreign investment meets their national interest. So for some area like the infrastructure, we also have some regulation in terms of how to make sure it fits Australian interests. So yeah.
Okay, according to the KPMG and Sydney University report, allegations about Chinese influence and increasing diplomatic tensions have given Chinese companies the impression that they're less welcome to invest in Australia. Actually, some 35% of the surveyed Chinese companies felt welcome to invest in Australia. That is a decline from the 52% in 2014. So, Professor Gong, given the current uncertainty in political relations between the two sides, do you foresee the drop continuing in the future?
I think, at least I don't see it rising anytime soon. I think the Morrison administration is not going to change course in a dramatic way. It's pretty much going to continue to tumble its policy, its China policy. So I think, you know, in this overall political environment in Australia right now is not very accommodating to investment from China, and this has been sort of brewing for some time, so you know it's a political risk. So I think in overall atmosphere on the China side, that foreign direct investment, outward foreign direct investment is slowing down. So adding these things up, I think I don't see any reason why it should rise anytime soon. But I'm not sure about a dramatic drop, though. But I hope it's not going to be a dramatic drop. And I also want to add a note that from Australian side, it's actually a concern not only with respect to reduced investment in Australia from China, but actually more concerned about the trading relationship between China and Australia. Australia is basically a resource exporting country, and China is a big buyer of these things. So I think they're probably more concerned about the exports part of the business.
Well, speaking of the different sectors, we can break it down as well. According to the Australian National University report, sector-wise, $29 billion of Chinese money came over from 2014 to 2017 into Australia, and mining received the most, that's $7 billion. Real estate the second with $6 billion, and now healthcare also starts to attract more interest from Chinese investment. So how does that reflect the current trend, and where do you think it is going in the near future, Professor Gong?
I think the real estate market still represents a very attractive opportunities. I mean, there are companies, and as well as individual investors who are immensely interested in investing in the real estate markets in Australia, looking for a place for a second home, and also the traveling convenience between Australia and China is actually quite good. I mean, there's not much of a visa issue here. So this is a very attractive place, and there's actually a lot of hard money in China chasing that market, and Australia can be a very attractive market. And the mining is traditionally a strength of Australia, but right now, the iron ore, for example, the pricing of iron ore isn't going up so fast. So I think, and this is actually initially mostly by state-owned companies, and they have their regulatory constraint imposed on them to make big deals.
Well, speaking of state-owned companies, another interesting finding by the Australian National University report says that investment into Australia actually came primarily from private Chinese companies. By the number of projects, only 15% of Chinese investment came from companies with a state-owned company as a parent company. By value, some 47% came from such companies. So the minority of Chinese investment in Australia come from state-owned enterprise. So it's clear that the majority are by private investors. So Professor Wang, let me go to you. Have the concerns about China's state-owned sector buying up large amounts of infrastructure and companies in Australia been overblown?
I think basically I speak for this issue is being state enterprises of China also investing in Australia, and also it's been there have been reports on that it's been declining the share of that. I think it's been state enterprises will play an important role in that, but also the private business, private-owned enterprises in China. It's been increasing investing in Australia, and they have a pretty good performance from a business perspective.
So do you think the report will have some part to play in assuaging the fears that the Chinese state may have too much influence, too much presence in the Australian economy, and maybe too much influence in the Australian politics, if it has any by now?
I think basically currently the Australian government already have those kind of measures, including the, for example, in the industry like the sector like critical infrastructure. They have a critical infrastructure center, and also the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act was also passed. So I think they already have those kind of measures in place to ensure that the foreign investment will make positive contribution to the prosperity of Australia. And I think generally the government, there's the domestic considerations being taken into account.
Well, some of these measures were actually put in place quite recently in light of China's increasing investment in Australia. For instance, when the Australian government, when the previous Australian government is pretty skeptical of China's Belt and Road initiative and has taken a tougher line on foreign investment, and also setting up the critical infrastructure center within the House Affairs Department to assess political acquisitions and effectively blocking some Chinese investment in some projects. Professor Wang, do you think China and Australia, the two governments, will be able to sit down and talk about these differences, or do you think the gap is too wide to bridge at this moment?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's been make a lot of sense for both sides. Actually, Australia has been one of the very limited number of major developed economies which has concluded, for example, bilateral free trade agreements with China, the Chapter, and also the bilateral investment treaty. So I think they already have those kind of the the trade pacts between both sides. And so also under that there will be the possibility for both sides to have this kind of dialogue and review of the trade and economic relationship. So, and also another side, both sides also have a shared interest in maintaining, for example, the free trade, liberalized investment system. So I think they definitely have room for both sides to build on their existing legal arrangements.
Okay, well, many thanks to my two guests. So that's all the time we have. Professor Heng Wang, Associate Professor and Co-Director for the China International Business and Economic Law Initiative at the University of New South Wales, and here in the studio, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.